The first time I saw him, he was standing on the tarmac at Da Nang, a young man of 22 encased in a flight suit that hadn't yet been stained by the sweat and fear of the jungle. His eyes held a kind of innocence that war had not yet written over. Lieutenant Michael Eagle Evans was a Huey helicopter pilot, a boy plucked from the warm dunes of California and dropped into the humid, suffocating hell of Vietnam. On that day, his commanders thought he was just a transport pilot. No one could have predicted that the secret this young man would carry back to base would eventually find its way into one of the Pentagon's most classified files, because his real mission that day was an operation that officially never existed. The orders given for that morning's launch seemed straightforward. He was to insert a squad of infantry into a dense, triple-canopy jungle region designated Red Diamond, a place so remote it barely had a mark on their maps, and then return to base. A routine transport run. But Eagle felt something was wrong. The moment the helicopter's rotor blades began their slow, heavy turn, the two other Hueys scheduled to fly with him that day had taken off an hour ahead of schedule, without any notification, slipping away into the dawn mist like ghosts. Furthermore, half of his regular crew had called in sick, replaced at the last minute by two taciturn technicians he had never seen before, men who offered no greetings and whose eyes seemed to look right through him. These details nagged at him, a dissonant chord in the symphony of a standard operation, but he had dismissed them as the usual chaos of war. The real shock was waiting for him as they approached the Red Diamond Zone. The air itself felt heavy, charged with an unusual tension. The radio frequencies, usually crackling with familiar traffic, were alive with encrypted, staccato messages he didn't recognize, the kind of traffic reserved for operations far above his pay grade. As he navigated through the cloud layers, Eagle could see movement in the green ocean below, far more than what a single infantry squad would generate. He spotted camouflaged positions, hastily constructed hide sites. This wasn't a simple insertion point, it was a staging ground. And then, a voice in his headset, a voice that did not belong to his base's control tower, cut through the static and changed everything. It came directly from an entity codenamed Shadow Command. The order was unequivocal. He was not to land. He was not to drop off the infantry. Instead, he was to alter his course to the northwest and perform a low-altitude pass over a set of coordinates provided, without touching down. The tone was not a request. It was an imperative, delivered with a cold authority that brooked no argument. Eagle hesitated for a fraction of a second, his mind racing. Behind him sat 12 young infantrymen, their faces a mixture of boredom and anticipation, completely unaware that their destination had just been erased. He could feel the weight of their expectation, but Shadow Command's authority was absolute, rumored to emanate from the highest, most clandestine levels of the war effort. To disobey was not just a court-martial, it was a professional death sentence, and possibly a literal one. A fierce internal conflict erupted within him, the trained soldier who followed orders versus the man who felt a profound responsibility for the lives in his care. Finally, with a gut-wrenching twist in his stomach, he made the decision his training and a deeper, more primal instinct demanded. He banked the Huey sharply to the northwest. In that moment he could almost feel the confused and then betrayed stares of the soldiers burning into the back of his neck. What Eagle couldn't possibly know then was that this single act of compliance would save the lives of those 12 men, but at the cost of carving a wound in his own soul that would never fully heal. They had been on the new course for barely 10 minutes when the radio channels dedicated to the original Red Diamond landing zone erupted in a cacophony of panicked, desperate transmissions. The area was a kill zone, engulfed in a ferocious, well-planned enemy ambush. Had he landed as initially ordered, his Huey would have been a sitting duck, torn to pieces on the ground, its crew and passengers slaughtered. This was the brutal validation of Shadow Command's order, a confirmation that sent a cold chill down his spine. But this fleeting sense of grim relief was instantly shattered by what he saw as they reached the secret coordinates. It wasn't a clearing or a fire base. It was a small, meticulously hidden research outpost that didn't exist on any map. And there, waiting for them, was a group of individuals who didn't wear standard American uniforms, dressed in civilian attire, but equipped with technology that looked anything but civilian. As Eagle expertly held the Huey in a low hover, one of the civilians, a man with a grim, determined expression, handed a sealed, reinforced steel briefcase up to Eagle's co-pilot. Not a single word was exchanged between them. Their eyes met for a brief, electric moment, and in that silent communication, Eagle understood that he was now part of something far larger and infinitely more dangerous than a simple transport run. The co-pilot, one of the mysterious replacements, took the case and immediately secured it in one of the helicopter's most concealed compartments, a space typically reserved for emergency survival gear. Eagle's mind reeled, trying to comprehend what could be so important, so secret. Was it intelligence documents, a new weapon prototype, something else entirely? His thoughts were violently interrupted by a new, frantic transmission cutting through the radio. It was a distress call. A handful of survivors from the Red Diamond ambush had managed to escape the initial onslaught and were now trapped deep behind enemy lines, their situation growing more desperate by the second. This was the crucible, the moment that would define Eagle's entire war and his life thereafter. In his possession was a mysterious briefcase handed to him by shadowy operatives under direct orders from a clandestine command. His official mission was clear: return to base immediately. But screaming in his ears were the voices of his fellow soldiers, American boys, his own age, begging for extraction, for a chance to live. He contacted Shadow Command, his voice tight with urgency, explaining the situation of the stranded men. The response he received was devoid of any humanity, a stark reminder of the cold calculus of war. The voice simply stated, "Continue your primary mission. Those soldiers are acceptable losses." The phrase "acceptable losses" echoed in his skull, a monstrous term that threatened to sever the final bonds between the soldier he was trained to be and the man he truly was. In that split second, staring out at the endless green canopy that was about to swallow those men whole, he made the most rebellious decision of his life. Defying the direct orders of the most powerful command he had ever encountered, he wrenched the controls and turned his helicopter back towards the heart of the Red Diamond Inferno. The two enigmatic technicians on board immediately and vehemently protested, their calm facades breaking to reveal a panicked anger. They argued, they threatened vague consequences, but Eagle, with a newfound steely resolve, reminded them that he was the aircraft commander, and the lives of American soldiers were his ultimate responsibility. The scene that greeted them at Red Diamond was one of pure chaos and devastation. The jungle was alive with the flash of muzzle fire and the thick, acrid smoke of burning vegetation. On the ground, a small, beleaguered group of grunts was pinned down, fighting a desperate last stand. Eagle's Huey was immediately met with a storm of enemy fire. Tracers streaked past the cockpit, rounds punched through the thin skin of the fuselage, and the plexiglass canopy spider-webbed with cracks. Yet, Eagle found a strange, hyper-focused calm. His hands were steady on the cyclic and collective, his mind processing 1,000 variables at once. He performed a series of near-impossible maneuvers, sliding the bulky helicopter into a tiny, fire-swept clearing, holding it in a precarious hover, just feet off the ground, as the door gunners laid down a suppressing curtain of fire. The seconds stretched into an eternity. He could see the faces of the grunts below, a mixture of terror and desperate hope, as they scrambled, dragged their wounded, and fought their way towards the waiting bird. The last soldier was hauled aboard. An eagle pulled pitch, the Huey groaning in protest as it clawed its way back into the sky, heavier now with the weight of saved lives. But their ordeal was far from over. A new, more insidious threat presented itself on the instrument panel. The fuel gauge was dipping into the red. The detour and the extended hover had consumed their reserves. They didn't have enough to make it back to Da Nang. And then came the final, chilling communication from Shadow Command. They knew everything. They had monitored his every move. The voice was icy, stripped of all emotion. It delivered an ultimatum that would haunt Eagle for decades. If you manage to return to base with that briefcase, this incident, including your rescue of those soldiers, never officially happened. It will be scrubbed from all records. But if that case is opened, or its contents are ever revealed, you and every man you saved today will be branded traitors to your country. Somehow, through a combination of sheer skill, nerve, and a favorable wind, Eagle nursed the crippled, fuel-starved helicopter back to the outskirts of Da Nang. The Huey touched down on the runway, not with a graceful landing, but with a final, shuddering gasp, a beaten and broken machine, but everyone inside was alive. The two mysterious technicians emerged from the wreckage, retrieved the unopened steel briefcase, and disappeared into the crowd of ground crew without a backward glance. Eagle and his crew were debriefed by stern-faced officers he didn't recognize, and were told in no uncertain terms that they were never to speak of the events of that day, under threat of severe and unspecified consequences. The official report filed that day stated that Lieutenant Evans's helicopter had experienced a critical engine failure during a routine logistics flight, forcing an early return. The ambush at Red Diamond, the secret outpost, the briefcase, and the heroic rescue, all of it was erased, as if it had been a fever dream. Lieutenant Michael Eagle Evans was never the same pilot again. The innocence in his eyes was gone, replaced by the heavy, unspoken knowledge of a truth that could never be shared. The contents of that briefcase remained a tormenting mystery, a ghost that would follow him home, a secret he would carry for 40 years, until a deathbed confession from a retired colonel would finally bring the truth to light. But that is a revelation for another time.